Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. And as always, thank you so much for listening, and thank you for supporting the show, and thank you for supporting Clay's efforts, including his upcoming Steinbeck tour, which he's going to tell you about now.
John Steinbeck, March 14th through 20th on the Monterey Peninsula in California with my friend Russ Eagle. I'm writing a book on Steinbeck and Sir Thomas Malory, the Arthurian cycle, the Morte d'Arthur. And Russ is writing a book on Cannery Row, the short novella that Steinbeck wrote just after World War II. But we go to see Steinbeck sites. We talk about the books in the morning, and then in the afternoon we go on these incredible excursions to some of the most beautiful landscapes in America. We get a tour of Doc's lab, Ed Ricketts' lab, which is still there, untouched, right in the heart of Monterey. And there's the aquarium, which we go to. It's a magnificent journey. So people can join us for this third Steinbeck cultural tour, again, March 14th through 20th. Also, the online courses. I'm in the middle of the Constitution course. We're going to be teaching one on water and the West. So lots of things going on, and just a great time. I just got back from, I should say this before I lose the opportunity to, we should probably do a program on it. I'm probably the last person to see the musical Hamilton. But thanks to good friends of mine, Oliver and Anna Schwab, I had the opportunity with my daughter Catherine to see Hamilton in London last week, and it was something, I'll tell you that. Historically, not entirely accurate, but from the point of view of musical entertainment, absolutely spectacular. And we absolutely, in every way, enjoyed sitting there and watching the apotheosis of a man who believed in hereditary monarchy and said that the people are a rabble who are not up to the business of self-government. Indeed worth seeing.
And people can find out more about your cultural tours and all the things you do by going to jeffersonhour.com. While you're there, you can send a question to Clay or to President Jefferson, and you can also support the show, which, again, we really appreciate. This week, we started talking about an article in the New York Times by Jamel Bowie about the Constitution, and Mr. Jefferson gave us a bit of a history lesson. I thought that was a very interesting conversation. Before we go to the show, there's one email that I didn't include in the show that I'm going to include now, a short one from Dennis Albers, who actually is from Bismarck, listens on the PBS station here. And his subject is the language of cottonwoods, essays on the future of North Dakota. He wants to know, how can I get an autographed copy of this book?
You can buy a copy and contact me through the Jefferson Hour, and I'll be happy to sign it. You can find contact information easily enough on the website, and we'll make it happen. I love to sign the book, of course. It's been out now for 3 months, 4 months. I'm exceptionally proud of it, and it's getting some really good reviews and a lot of readership around the country. And it's everyone who writes to me from West Virginia or from Florida or Texas says it's not really about North Dakota, it's really about rural America. So take that, Heidi Heitkamp. Heidi Heitkamp, former U.S. Senator from North Dakota.
She got to you, didn't she?
Read my book. I am a believer in the renewal of rural America, but I don't think that her plan to explain the Democrats' platform better to rural America is the answer. I think there is a spiritual, economic, political crisis in rural America that has to be addressed, and that this phenomenon, the sort of the Trump populism, this anger, it has to do with rural decline. And rural decline means we haven't invested enough in rural America. We haven't invested enough in the education of rural America. And I'd be very happy to debate her, but if she wants to see some proposed solutions, she should read the book.
Couldn't you just have a conversation with her?
No, we're going to debate. She called me out. You said you did this. You threw kerosene on this.
This was a 2.5 minute audio clip, and you're throwing a book that took you years to write. As you know, I'll call the senator. She said she'd be on the show. I'll try to get it set up. But meanwhile,
tell her, get her in studio, and I'll have an autographed copy of the book, and I'm happy to read sections to her on the air.
I love her. She's great.
I love her too, but I want to debate her because I think that she's right that the crisis of rural America is the crisis of our times. The question is, what's the answer to that crisis? So
that's a good subject for talk.
John Steinbeck,
I'll try to make that happen.
In California, the Jefferson Hour. Support us if you can. We love what we get to do. Yes, Hamilton is a great musical. I've admitted it. Let's go to the show.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay Jenkinson. I'm your host, David Swenson, and I am so pleased to welcome you this week, Mr. Jefferson. Good day to you, sir.
Good day to you, my dear citizen.
Mr. Jefferson, as an American citizen, I feel that a personal understanding of our Constitution and our government is a duty I have. And several listeners recently brought my attention to an article in the New York Times written by a Mr. Jamel Bowie titled, "Constitutional Change Will Be Here Sooner Than We Think." And while I don't know that I can agree with that headline, it is something that I know you feel strongly about.
Well, I feel that the people are sovereign, that all governments derive from the sovereignty of the people, and that the people are free to change their government anytime it suits them, and that they should do so from time to time. In fact, in a letter to James Madison in 1787, I said the earth belongs to the living, not the dead, and if you accept that natural law principle, you should tear up or revise your Constitution once every generation so that the rising generation can form its own government and consent to it, just as we did after the Revolution created a breakdown of civil order in our own time. So I certainly believe in constitutional change, and I would hope that the United States would grow in enlightenment as well as in population, that as science gives us new insights, as new technologies emerge, as we have greater understanding of the nature of self-government, that we will revise our instruments, our Constitution, state and national, so that they become more perfect over time.
In this article, Mr. Bowie writes, "The American Confederation began life as a wartime alliance between the 13 former colonies operating through the Second Continental Congress, which, according to historian Robert Middlecoff, provided the center from which the war could be directed. The Continental Congress took responsibility for leading the states. It established an army, sent envoys abroad, issued currency, and borrowed money. It did all these things and many more without any clear authority except necessity and the tacit approval of the states." So, Mr. Jefferson, does this match your recollection of events of your time?
Yes, we had 13 separate charters with Great Britain. We were colonies. In 1776, we declared independence and formed a loose alliance of those 13 now highly independent states. They were sovereign, but we knew that we needed to come together, in certain ways at least, to fight off the British, the most powerful army and navy in the world. And so we formed the Articles of Confederation, which was a makeshift constitutional confederation designed to help get us through the war. And at that time, we did not know what would come afterwards. We assumed that we would eventually win our independence, and we did. We did not, at the time, necessarily believe we would form a perpetual union. In other words, it was an instrument, the Articles of Confederation, to get us through a crisis. And we didn't have time to think about what an eventual continental union would look like. Certainly, we didn't intend the Articles to have any perpetual legitimacy beyond the exigency, the emergency of the war. Afterwards, some people wanted to continue this very loose confederation, and frankly, I was one of them. I always regarded myself as a Virginian first and an American second. But others, including my closest friend James Madison and Alexander Hamilton and George Washington and others, pushed for a more centralized nation state. They had found the inefficiencies in the Articles of Confederation during the war, and they were, in many respects, quite inefficient. And now they pushed for a true continental union, and that led to the Constitutional Convention between May 25th and September 17th of 1787 in Philadelphia. I was not there, but they threw out the makeshift Articles of Confederation and started fresh. And before they had finished, they had produced a much more centralized national government than had been contemplated under the Articles, and frankly, more centralized than many Americans were comfortable with, including myself.
Mr. Bowie gives us a bit of a history lesson, and I like that, so we can better understand ourselves and how our government came to be. He writes that shortly after issuing its Declaration of Independence in July 1776, the Continental Congress began work on a constitution that would define and formalize its authority. In November 1777, the Continental Congress sent its final draft of the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union to the states for ratification. He writes there were holdouts, but by March 1781, all 13 states had joined the compact. So we were at war, and we really had no ratified constitution. This period of 4 years, government continued with no real overlying agreement. Am I right?
That is correct. But the authority, A, derives from the people, and B, it came out of the Second Continental Congress. So the Continental Congresses of 1774 and then 1775 and 6 were emergency meetings of the concerned states, the colonies, and we named George Washington to be the commander-in-chief. I was on a committee of 5 to draft a Declaration of Independence. We did a whole range of other emergency things. So, and the vacuum that followed, we formed a makeshift government under the First and Second Continental Congresses. Then, as you have reported, the Articles of Confederation were drawn up in 1776, but they weren't fully ratified until 1781, when the war was nearly over. But we operated with them as if they had been ratified, frankly, because we had no other choice. And keep in mind that under the Articles, every state had one vote in every legislative action. That's one thing that made it inefficient. A second great inefficiency under the Articles was that they could not be amended without unanimous consent. And so you couldn't amend them unless you got all 13 colonies, now states, to agree to the amendment, something of a statistical impossibility. And third, the states under the Articles were not required to supply material and funds, taxes. They were requisitioned under that system by the national legislature to provide such funds. But those orders could only come as appeals, as requisitions. And under the Articles, there was no national enforcement power to require recalcitrant states to put forward the money that they owed to the success of the American Revolution. So I experienced this as the wartime governor of Virginia, trying to supply Washington with the horses and the hay and the blankets and the saddles and the rifles and the lead and the gunpowder that he needed. And secondly, George Washington and Hamilton and others experienced at the national level. I was a state governor in Virginia. They were fighting the war all across the continent, all the way from New Hampshire down to almost to Georgia. And they couldn't get the things they needed from the recalcitrant states. And so the worst behavior, this is sort of Gresham's law of politics, but the bad behavior drove out the good. And there was a kind of a race to the bottom on noncompliance with federal requests. So we all knew that there was something fundamentally wrong with this makeshift constitution, the Articles of Confederation. The question was, what is the remedy? In my opinion, the remedy would have been a few careful amendments to the Articles, which I loved. I think these could have been done quite easily, and the most important of them would be to have some coercive power in the national authority so that it could collect taxes and do what nations do. That's not what happened in Philadelphia. Instead of providing a few careful and targeted amendments to the Articles, they replaced the Articles with the Constitution that you still use in your own time, and it, in many respects, swallows up the states. And so it's no longer a loose confederation of sovereign individual states like Maryland and New York. It's now a national government leaning on the population as a whole. The states still play a role, but their role is much diminished from their more primary position under the Articles.
Towards the end of the article, Mr. Bowie talks about change. He says if the story of the Articles of Confederation tells us anything, it is that these flaws, the ones you just talked about, sir, are in themselves not enough to prompt change, And he says what will bring change is when those flaws render the country too dysfunctional to tackle its most existential challenges.
I could not agree with that more. I would hope that as an enlightened nation, the United States would proactively seek those changes. In other words, not wait until crisis and dysfunction and semi-collapse, but look from time to time at the system and say, how can we make it better? How can we reform it? How can we make it, to use the term from the preamble of the Constitution, a more perfect union? The idea of behaving only reactively when things have gone terribly wrong does not sound like enlightenment to me, but better that than national collapse. And so if this author believes that that constitutional change is coming, does he specify what that change is and how it comes about?
No, sir, he does not.
Then you have to ask yourself, yourself and everyone who is listening, in your time, at this juncture in the history of the American experiment, is your system functioning or not functioning? Is it functioning efficiently and doing the things that a great nation must do to protect itself and to secure the rights and liberties of its people and to facilitate economic exchange? Or has it failed in some fundamental sense to do those things? In other words, are you in a crisis or are you merely in a difficult patch? I think most people are conservatives. I was one myself in many respects, and I would rather stick with an imperfect system if we think we can reform it than to panic. It seems to me that the spirit of the Constitution that was written in 1787 is a good one. Certainly I agree with its fundamental structure of 3 branches of government, of 2 houses of Congress, and so on and so forth, separation of powers. It's only if you think that your system is in a terminal state, which is making it impossible for the country to do the things that a great nation must do, it's only then that you really need to feel any emergency.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jefferson. We're going to take a short break, but we'll return to this conversation in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. And again, sir, I thank you for answering listener questions today.
My delight, sir.
Before we move on to another, do you have any additional thoughts on this article about the Constitution by Jamel Bowie that you'd like to share?
Well, the question is, how do you bring about fundamental constitutional change? I've already explained that the war, the crisis of our War of Independence forced us to produce a makeshift government. We then, in some regards, codified that under the Articles of Confederation, eventually ratified in 1781. The war ended. The question was, now what? Did we want to try to perpetuate the Articles of Confederation, or did we wish to pursue something more centralized and nationally efficient? I was a friend of the Articles, and I was sorry to see us move into a very different direction. But here's what happened in Philadelphia. Their instructions, their mandate, coming from all 13 states, was to make repairs to the Articles. And in fact, in the formal legislative instructions in several states, including the state of Delaware, the legislatures specifically said you must not tear up this Constitution and start fresh. You are only authorized to make certain carefully targeted adjustments for the purposes of more efficient commerce. In other words, several states only sent delegates to Philadelphia for amendments to the Articles, forbidding them to wipe the slate clean and start over. And yet, when they met, almost the first thing they did was agree to tear up the Articles of Confederation and start fresh, start from nothing. This offended delegates from Delaware and other places because they were now violating the explicit instructions of their home states. And so this air of quasi-legitimacy hung over the Constitutional Convention. In the end, they managed to produce a new constitution, and there were specific ratifying conventions in every state, and by 1788. Enough states had ratified so that we did produce a new union, the union that you still live by under the terms of the Constitution of the United States. But this was a fairly problematic situation of exceeding the authority that was given to the convention in Philadelphia. If you, in your time, despair of your Constitution, if you think that you need to work on the Emoluments Clause or the Second Amendment or the Impeachment Clause or the Pardon Clause or whatever changes you might wish to make, there is an amendment process. If you don't think the amendment process can work, there is a way to call for a new convention. But if a number of people just said, well, let's meet in Denver on the second Tuesday of May next to talk about these things, and when those delegates got there, they tore up the Constitution of the United States and produced something entirely different, exceeding their explicit authority, that would create a problem of legitimacy for whatever Constitution followed. And so that has to be really very well understood, that the Founding Fathers left Philadelphia with two paths to renewal. One was amendment, and the other path was to call a new constitutional convention, which has never occurred in the history of the United States. They explicitly put clauses into it for renewal or revision, but they did not authorize what essentially amounts to a legal junta of a group meeting without explicit constitutional basis under the existing system.
Thank you, Mr. Jefferson. Let's move on to another question. This one comes from Mr. Anthony Farmer. He writes, "Hello, I was wondering how people who traveled overseas, like yourself, Mr. Franklin, and Mr. Adams, paid for things in another country during the 1700s. How did the U.S. government pay for them? And how did they use their own money? What money did they use? I don't expect they brought big bags of cash with them."
It's a very good question, because in your time you have a system of international exchange, and the exchange rates are set by banks and by other international authorities. And so if you take American dollars to Great Britain, you then exchange them for British pounds. And if you take American dollars to, say, France or Portugal, you exchange them for the euro currency. And these things have been in place for a very long time, and it operates effortlessly. In my time, it was a nightmare. And so it's true, we did not take bags of money. We took letters of authority. And so I was paid a certain type of salary to be the American minister to France. And this included two types of emolument. One was my actual salary as the American minister. And then there was an allowance for the things you need, a carriage, renting a place to live, servants, etc. And so these were separate but essentially lumped in the same way. And so the United States would then issue a piece of paper that had the strength of a treaty, and I would be able to take that to an agent in France, and that agent would then enable me to make purchases in Paris under that broad authority, and subtracting those sums from the total amount of the appropriation by the Congress of the United States for this moment. And so I eventually, of course, had French francs and French money, but the exchange was not as simple as it would be in your time, and it was a relatively involved thing. I can give you an example from our own country. When I sent Meriwether Lewis up the Missouri in 1804, I gave him a universal letter of credit with the seal of the United States and my signature on it, so that if he came to a vessel at the mouth of the Columbia, say a Spanish vessel or a British vessel or even a Russian vessel, he could use that certificate to get whatever he might need: gunpowder, pork, flour, new clothing for the men, whatever his needs were. And then that government, or that, let's say it's a Spanish ship, the Spanish ship would then have its government back in Madrid requisition repayment from the United States government. So it was very, very complex and very cumbersome, and the author of the letter is quite right to say that it was something of a nightmare.
So, sir, it sounds to me as if you did, in fact, work on a system of credit. You didn't have credit cards like we do in my time, but this must have involved a level of trust, sir.
Well, this is how the economy worked, generally speaking. We didn't have an adequate financial system in my time. So even as a Virginia planter, I would plant tobacco or wheat. At the end of the year, I would take the harvest to a wharf in Richmond. At Richmond, there would be an inventory of such things. There would be a factor there who handled these sorts of arrangements. And then he would ship that tobacco, let's say, to Southampton in England. And at Southampton, there would be another agent who would inventory it and make sure that it hadn't been destroyed by vermin of some sort or there hadn't been theft. And then that would be credited to me. And now an agent, a factor in London who handled my affairs there would know that I had X thousand pounds of tobacco and that tobacco was worth such and such a sum of British pounds sterling. And that now would be a credit to me. And meanwhile, I would have sent that factor a list of things I wanted. I wanted some silverware. I wanted tablecloths. I wanted lace. I wanted bolts of cloth. I wanted a sideboard for my dining room. I wanted a desk or wine or Madeira or whatever it might be. And using that very crude system of exchange, that how many barrels of tobacco has Mr. Jefferson supplied at Richmond, which then were transshipped to Southampton, what was their value in the current market in England, and then how can we then supply Mr. Jefferson with the material things that he wants, the furniture, the scarves, the dresses, the musical instruments, and deduct from the total value of what he has and get those things all back to him in something like a timely fashion. I should add books to this list, of course. And what happened was, as everybody who studies my era knows, is that we were never recompensed enough for our tobacco or wheat, and that every year we went a little bit farther into debt with these British agents, and the British agents would be all smiles and say, "Oh, don't worry about it, Mr. Jefferson. I'm sure next year's harvest will be a better one. I'll continue to send you these commodities, all this furniture, all these bolts of cloth." And over time, we got deeper and deeper and deeper into debt with British agents. And then I would have to borrow money to pay some of them off so that I could maintain my line of credit with them. And the borrowing would be very informal under your standards and often usurious rates of interest. And so it was almost impossible to prosper. The things we thought we needed, porcelain, paintings, a couch, a sofa, the things we thought we needed always tended to exceed our economic capacity to pay for them. But there was no system of ready money. And there was a very elastic sense of trust until such time as we were clearly not going to be able to pay back the sum in our lifetime. And then things got a little bit more aggressive and tense.
Thank you, Mr. Jefferson. This next question comes from Jay Jansen. He writes, Mr. Jefferson, your theory of the pursuit of happiness has become more obvious during the recent pandemic. People wanting to live their lives exercising their personal freedom, not to wear a mask in public, to not get vaccinated, or to social distance. What was your definition of the pursuit of happiness?
Well, it's a long and difficult discussion we might have, but let me explain what I meant in the Declaration of Independence. John Locke, in his second treatise on government, had spoken of life, liberty, and property, or life, liberty, and estate. I changed that to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, partly because slavery is a species of property, and I did not want to give Southern slaveholders any sense that they had a sacred right to the ownership of other human beings, and partly because I wanted a more open-ended finish to this trinity of American values. And so I said pursuit of happiness, meaning the pursuit of public happiness, not what one does on a Tuesday afternoon or how much wine one drinks or how one socializes in a home community. That's a very private thing, and it doesn't rise to the level of a document like the Declaration of Independence. What I meant is, how do you pursue public happiness? And public happiness is something like creating conditions under which the great mass of people in a community can thrive. How do you organize your economy and your political structure so that most people can thrive? Not everyone will be able to thrive under any system, but you want the maximum amount of public possibility, public security, public rule of law, public participation in self-government. And so that all adds up to a public pursuit of happiness. It has nothing to do with how much time one seeks in personal pleasure.
I read this letter about the pursuit of happiness, sir, and it made me think of a column that I read recently. A gentleman by the name of Jim Fugely recently posted this on his Prairie blog about a friend of his who is hospitalized and suffering from COVID. And of course, we wish his friend well and hope for a speedy and complete recovery. But in his column, Mr. Fugely talked about shared suffering and shared responsibility. And with your permission, sir, I'd like to read a portion to you. He wrote, "If you have a friend or family member deep in the throes of COVID, you know what I am talking about, and I bet you, too, are experiencing the anger I feel at those of our leaders who many months ago and still today could have found the courage to say to the naysayers, 'No, you are wrong. Science is right, and these are the steps, however unpleasant they may be, that we are going to take to put an end to this horrible epidemic. Your personal freedoms are not being taken away if I require you to wear a mask and get a vaccination to try to stop the spread of this awful disease. You are showing that you care about the health and safety of your friends, your neighbors, and all the fellow North Dakotans you don't know and likely will never know, but who will go on to live long and prosperous lives because we did what was right.'" So when I hear you talk about the pursuit of happiness and I hear people complain about losing personal freedoms, Mr. Jefferson, to me, sir, his point is that as Americans, we should all be willing to sacrifice some of our comfort or our pursuit of happiness in the name of public good. And I agree with them.
We live in a community, and we all have to make little sacrifices in order to maintain social harmony. I wrote a letter about this, speaking of artificial good humor, that we often become frustrated by others, or they behave in such a way that impairs our own joy. But if we want to get along in community, we must always make these little sacrifices. And in the end, they don't amount to much because social harmony is such an important good. And so I agree, of course, that we need, in a moment when there is a national or international pandemic, to quietly agree to do things that are annoying to us or frustrating to us for the greater good of the community. And everybody knows this. This is a very simple understanding of community ethics. People may choose to make an issue of a thing like this, but in doing so, they're not violating the Constitution as much as they are violating the sort of fundamental fabric of what a social order looks like. Because we would have no friends if we condemned everyone for their mistakes or the worst of their behavior. Life requires a very large measure of forbearance, tolerance, generosity of spirit, and self-sacrifice. And especially when there is an epidemic. I lived through one in Philadelphia in 1793, and that one killed 1 in 10. And I can assure you that the community made some regulations so that we could all get through this with the minimal loss of life. And if people had said, "I'm just not doing it," they might not have been arrested, but they might have been bullied or even beaten by their neighbors, because you have to do those things that are important for the greater good of the Commonwealth in a time of emergency. And this is exceedingly important in a time of epidemics, because you can't know how the disease is being transferred. You can walk into a room and maybe 100% of the people are healthy. Or you could walk into a room and 3% are diseased, or 38%. But the only way to ensure that the spread of the disease does not overcome your capacity to handle it is to practice such health measures as are likely to minimize the destructiveness of such a thing. And I certainly believe in science. Science is the most important factor in all of this. Science is not something that's susceptible to political debate. There are things that you cannot defy merely because you dislike them. And science is that body of individuals and methods which give us a very sure sense of the truth about life. And to defy that would be like pretending you could jump off the Tower of Pisa and defy gravitation.
So it's really not a matter of personal freedoms or them being taken away. It's acting responsibly for the good of society. Is that right, sir?
It's seeing beyond yourself. Successful social life requires you to live beyond the boundaries of your own self-interest. And all of us learn that from earliest childhood. And if you don't learn it from civics, you can learn it from the Bible. I'm a Unitarian myself, but as I understand it, what Jesus said was that we should do unto others as we would have them do unto us. And so if I want to protect myself from an epidemic, then I would expect others to show the care that would maximize my chances for survival. And in turn, I will make those sacrifices that help others around me survive in a moment of international crisis. And that this is really the most basic ethical understanding, that we have duties which take us far beyond individual happiness and far beyond some I think, misguided sense of individual freedom and liberty.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jefferson.
You're welcome.
We're going to take a short break, but when we return, we'll be joined by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, the gentleman who portrays Mr. Jefferson, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson, sitting virtually across from the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. David Swenson. David, let me say this per the last question about civic-mindedness during a pandemic. I was in London visiting my daughter at Oxford University, and I flew back the other day from London Heathrow to Phoenix. A flight of more than 11 hours in the air, and before that we were 2.5 hours on the tarmac at Heathrow. So about 13, maybe almost 14 hours that I was in this airplane. There were about 250 people, maybe 190 people, but a lot of people on this airplane. Every seat was taken, and everyone wore a mask for the entire time that we were doing this. Everyone complied. None of us was happy. After 4 or 5 hours, the mask is annoying. It begins to break down a little bit. It causes a little irritation and an itching feeling. At times you feel you can't breathe. It's hard enough to fly for 13 hours no matter what. But when you now have this added annoyance, it's very frustrating. But you know what? Everyone complied. And why did they comply? Because the airlines won't let you fly unless you comply. And we've seen that some people have been removed from airplanes and forbidden to fly again because of their angry non-compliance with this code. If you walk into a Ace Hardware store or into a certain type of national chain store, they will not serve you unless you wear a mask. And although it's annoying for some people, they do it because they want to make the purchase in that facility. And so my question is, why do we comply with capitalist commercial enterprises in the way that we do, with some annoyance, but nevertheless full compliance? And yet when government asks us to do something, suddenly now we're in a question of Patrick Henry and fundamental liberty and the rights of man and don't tread on me and how dare you tell me this or how dare you tell me that. Government is that entity which was set up to make hard decisions for human beings in times of emergency. That's why they can conscript us into wars when necessary. That's why they can raise taxes in an emergency when necessary. That's why they can close an interstate highway during a blizzard. That we've created this social compact and given bureaucrats and representatives from amongst ourselves the power to do certain things on behalf of the greater good of the community. And yet when that happens, when there's a mask order in a town in Nebraska or a mask order in a school district in Florida, people go nuts and start singing the song of human liberty. But when they want Starbucks, they snap on their mask and go in and get it. It's essentially insane that we have traded our angst about corporations, which used to be deeply exploitative of human beings and in many respects still are. And now we've transferred our sense of liberty to government. No government anywhere in this country wants to issue a mask order. No government wants to have quarantines. You should have seen the number of hoops that I had to jump through, first to go to London and then to come back. So I'm in London. I'm coming back a few days later. I have to go get an emergency rapid COVID test. It costs 69 pounds sterling, which is about $100, a little less than $100. I stand in line for over an hour to get it. Then you wait for the results. Then you have to find a printer. Then you have to also show that you have a double vaccine. So I had my vaccine card with me. At London Heathrow, there was hoop after hoop after hoop I had to go through to get on an airplane to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. And yet, if I walked into a U.S. post office and the guard said, please put on your mask, now I'm going to throw a fit? Now I'm going to say you've trampled upon my human rights? It's insane what we're doing here. And if you ever, when we say in the cliche, is that the hill you want to die on? Is the hill you want to die on a mask order during a time of international emergency? And our friend Jim Fugly wrote this column, this blog, because he now has been touched twice. He had a brother who was affected by COVID and is no longer alive, and now one of his closest friends is in the ICU because of this. Now, whether you can trace this to noncompliance with mask orders is a question that we can't answer. But you take Jim's point that this is not a time for us to be erecting artificial flags that say, don't tread on me. We've got to get through this, and that means we have to get through this together. This is not a disease like Parkinson's that doesn't spread. This is a disease that gets spread by human contact, and so the only known effective means beyond vaccines are physical separation and wearing prophylactic masks. And to think that somehow awakens the Patrick Henry in you, live free or die, as if you're a person from New Hampshire during the time of the Minutemen and the Green Mountain Boys of Vermont, that just belittles the very idea of the American experiment, in my opinion.
We both know Jim Fugly, and I particularly enjoyed this column. Again, his name is Jim Fugly, and it's the Prairie Blog, worth reading. In his blog, he calls politicians to account for not saying to people, we need to do this as Americans, and the responsibility. This has nothing to do with personal freedoms. It's uncomfortable, but I think as citizens, we all need to sacrifice a bit of our comfort for the common good. I want to move on to another letter and also welcome you back from England. This one comes from close to England, from Scotland. Kat McKinnon wrote, and she said, since we stumbled across your show on the radio during a road trip through North Carolina in 2018, my partner Adam has been an avid listener to your thoughtful discussions. Well, thank you, Adam. Since then, you have provided a weekly companion in our home in Edinburgh and provided much comfort during a particularly tough year with lockdowns in the UK. We have lost jobs and loved ones this year, but always found the Jefferson Hour to be a welcome distraction in our darkest hours and food for hearty debate in happier times. I'm blushing. I hope you are too, Clay. Adam is a Scottish solicitor with a passion for history and American constitutional affairs, and he's turning 30 on the 26th of November. We both would want to take the opportunity to wish him a happy 30th birthday.
Yes, happy birthday to Adam, his 30th birthday in Scotland. What a great place to be able to live. My daughter studied at St. Andrews in Scotland for 18 months, and she later said that year, that extended year there, was the happiest of her life so far. On the airplane coming back from London Heathrow, I was in a very cramped situation. I won't go into detail, but the people next to me were taking more than their share of the airspace, let's put it that way. And so I couldn't read. I watched a film starring Anne Hathaway, of all people, called Lockdown. Locked Down. And it's about this very issue, about the nervous uncertainty, fear, anxiety, claustrophobia, feeling imprisoned within work, within relationships, whatever it might be. And it's actually a terrific film, Locked Down. And I certainly understand, everyone suffers from these things, David. You and I both know that. And you especially suffer from them when you're cooped up. And the pandemic has cooped a lot of people up. And I think that the psychological impact of the pandemic, the corrosive effect of it on our happiness, has been severe. I've known it in people very close to me. I've seen a little of it in myself, but fortunately I'm a pathetic workaholic, and so I don't give myself a lot of time to brood.
Next up is a letter from John Gladson, and he wrote he was a bit upset about Lindsay Chervinsky's comments when she was on the show. He said, "I was appalled to hear Lindsay Chervinsky accuse the Republican Party of attempting to destroy our election system. It is not the Republicans who are changing the rules to favor themselves, fighting against voter ID, trying to control what information the public gets, and attempting various rigging strategies, court packing, adding states, abolishing electoral college, ending the filibuster to stay in power forever." And I read that and thought I should give Lindsay an opportunity to respond to that directly. So I got in touch with her, and she sent me a recorded response to that letter, and I'm going to play it for you now.
Thanks so much to David and Clay for giving me the opportunity to respond to John Gladstone's message. So I'm not sure that any response that I might offer would convince John or change his mind, but I thought it might be helpful for me to respond in case other listeners had questions as well. So I am happy to debate the merits of Supreme Court reform, abolishing the filibuster, ID requirements for voters, or how much early or mail-in voting should be allowed in each state. In a democracy, I tend to think that all citizens should be able to easily vote, and politicians should want to stand for election based on their values and principles rather than making it harder for certain segments of the population to vote. But I am willing to acknowledge that there is at least good faith arguments on both sides, and I will gladly have those respectful conversations. However, we cannot debate the sanctity of our elections as the centerpiece of our democracy. Free elections are the hallmark of any democracy, which means that one person or one side is going to win and the other is going to lose. As an American, I know that sometimes my preferred candidate will win and sometimes they won't. And when a politician loses in a democracy, they accept the outcome and they hand over power, ideally peacefully. Just as President Bush and the Republicans did when President Obama won in 2008, just as President Obama did when President Trump won in 2016, and just like the Democrats did last week when Glenn Youngkin won the governor's race in Virginia. However, after the 2020 presidential election, many Republicans refused to recognize the results, even after leading officials from Attorney General William Barr to local office holders in Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Arizona acknowledged that there was no evidence of fraud. The 2020 election was the most scrutinized election in modern history. And after the election, several Republican-led states actually conducted audits of the results. These audits confirmed the outcome, that Joe Biden won handily. And yet, with absolutely zero evidence, many Republicans continue to deny that Biden is president. That isn't the behavior of leaders that believe and uphold democracy. That is the behavior of autocrats and dictators. If that isn't undermining the electoral process, I don't know what is. Thanks again to both of you for having me on, offering me the opportunity to respond, and I look forward to talking to you guys again soon.
Well, that was great. What this tells me is how toxic our system is and how poisoned, because Democrats of the left will argue that in state after state, bills have been debated or passed which amount to voter suppression, particularly voter suppression of people who live in the inner cities, of poor people, of African Americans and other minorities. On the other hand, now this man argues that the Democrats are trying to get rid of the filibuster to stay permanently in power. That's nonsense. It's one thing to want to stay in power. Everybody does. Everybody who holds power wants to keep it. But the filibuster is not about that. The filibuster is about majority rule. The question is essentially what Lindsay says, which is that if you have an election, you want to make sure that every eligible person has the right to vote, and that vote is secure, and that vote is counted, and that we can feel confident in the results of the tally. That's all you want. And so we decide who's a citizen of the United States. In the United States, anyone who is 21 years old or over, who was born in this country or who has been naturalized, has a right to vote. And we want to get all of them if we can. And because of the technologies that are emerging, we have mail-in ballots in many states. I'm sure we're going to move to electronic balloting. We do everything else electronically, from buying and selling stocks to renewing our driver's licenses and our car tags. So it's only a matter of time before we find some secure way to vote electronically. And all you want to do is make sure that the system is secure and that fraud is kept to an absolute minimum. The idea that there is some sort of deep irregularity in our system, especially after the 2020 election, appears to me to be nonsense. So I don't see what the fuss is about. Let's make sure everyone who wants to vote can vote. Let's make sure that the systems are secure. Let's have double and triple auditing. Let's make sure that any irregularities are investigated in the courts or in other commissions, and we move forward.
Speaking of Lindsay and filibusters and the Senate, the last time she was on, I felt a bit outnumbered because the two of you were in agreement about that the Senate should be reformed in some way, and I talked about the filibuster. So recently, I had the good fortune to have former North Dakota Senator Heidi Heitkamp in the studio, and I thought, now, I would like to get her opinion on this, and I explained the circumstances, and she was gracious enough to give me a statement and also agree to be on the Jefferson Hour in the near future.
I hope you preface this with her in a fair-minded way. It sounds to me like you're loading the decks with a United States senator, but go ahead.
Number one, it's a pipe dream. It's never going to happen because just as you may argue that we have outsized power in the Electoral College, we also have outsized power in amending the Constitution. So why don't you figure out a way that we can all get along and we can be more persuasive to rural America about policies that we all agree on? You know, that you're trying to take the shortcut. It's like, if you don't have a good kicker, let's eliminate the field goal, right? So find a good kicker. Play by the rules you got because they're not changing. And so all this talk about how you're going to reform is meaningless. There's things that you can do short of filibuster reform. I mean, I just keep saying, okay, you reform the filibuster and you eliminate it. It's just going to create massive swings in public policy with no certainty. And so to me, the tougher question is, so it's really too hard for you to figure out how to appeal to rural voters? You've given up on rural voters, Clay? Wasn't Thomas Jefferson the agrarian president? He believed in the strength of rural America. So you've given up on his dream of that's where the moral turpitude of the country lies? I haven't given up on rural America.
All I can say is I've been misrepresented. I agree with the distinguished Senator Heidi Heitkamp that it's a virtual impossibility to believe that we would reform this system or the Electoral College. But as someone who got defeated in the state of North Dakota, a very good, decent, thoughtful, intelligent, and productive United States senator, a senator who is widely respected for her work and her bipartisan work, she should know that rural America is not going to be as easily repaired as she seems to think. And I simply do think in closing, David, that states like Wyoming and North Dakota and Alaska and South Dakota and Vermont have too much power in our system, that we need to weight it more proportionally if we're going to be an advanced industrial civilization in the second half of the 21st century. So go to the website, jeffersonhour.com. The Steinbeck trip for May 14th to 20th still has open places. What a delight to hear from Lindsay Chervinsky, all the people who raised questions. Adam, happy birthday. David, great to see you, and we'll see you all next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes of Thomas Jefferson.